Welcome to today's masterclass. So I'm hoping that at the end of today, I'll have given you some theory, but actually some practical insights as well. We'll get some hands-on experience here with one of the complexity methods that I use quite a lot, that I find quite beneficial. And we'll actually start delving then into some stories if we were interested in doing that on a wider scale as well. So I'm hoping it won't be too heavy and too intense, and there'll be enough space for conversing with each other and connecting and telling our own stories within the session as well. So without further ado, I'm going to present my screen and we'll get cracking here. So I just want to double check. Can people see my screen? Kelvin or Edwarda, can you see me presenting the screen here? Yeah, you can.
Yes.
Brilliant, very good. So yeah, as the heading says, even dead fish go with the flow. So the hope today is that we'll actually start showing a bit of resilience and start going upstream and against the flow, sometimes rather than being taken with the current, but we'll go through that there shortly. So a little bit about my own experience. My own background would be in pharmaceuticals, kind of fell into health and safety in the latter time of my experience with Pfizer pharmaceuticals. I was there for about 15 years, and since then I have gone into consultancy. I lecture in a local university, and there's some contributions. There was 2 chapters to 2 books, which are there here on the screen for anybody who'd be interested in checking those out. But one that I would definitely be recommending to people on a follow-up of today's course is Cynefin, which is weaving sense making into the fabric of our world. And I would have wished, when I would have set out back in the day, that such a book would have been there, because you were just kind of going around trying to get your information from, going to courses, which is fantastic, and reaching out to people. But this is a really, really good resource, and I'd highly recommend it. It's very reasonable. It's like 20 euros or something like that. It's not very expensive, but it'll be, if you're interested in complexity, it'll be a huge benefit to actually to get that book. So I suppose just a little bit on my complexity journey. I would have started off back in London back 6 or 7 years ago, when I would have gone on my first complexity course, and I would have been introduced to that in the Netherlands, and it has taken me to Dublin, and I've gotten Dave Snowden to host Cynefin, one of the retreats on the Aran Islands here in Ireland, gone to a complexity symposium in the States, gone over visiting University of Canvas. I've been up to Vancouver to Whistler, where I met some great people, the likes of Gary Wong, Steve McCrone, Sonia Bleakno, Dave himself. So this is kind of where it's taken me, and that's outside of numerous courses as well. So it's been super interesting, and yeah, so I'm hoping to share my insights with you today, in the hope that they'll be beneficial. So a bit of a disclaimer, okay? I don't know if any of you remember Fawlty Towers and Manuel, and his famous line was, "I know nothing," and it's a bit like, I remember when I started out in complexity, it's nearly like a whole new language, and sometimes we can get a bit bamboozled and caught up, because it's nearly like learning, what does this mean? What does that mean? There are so many big words in there. So I'm trying to take some of that today to break it down a bit into something that's digestible. And I'm not saying I'm the guru that's out there that has all the answers. We have 3 hours here this morning, but I do my best to present some of the foundations, to give you hands-on on some of the tools, and hopefully you'll walk away with a better understanding and an appetite to do some more. Because I know Kelvin and the crew at Art of Work are actually developing a self-guided course in relation to complexity, which will build on some of what we're doing here today as well, which we'll go into a bit more detail. So just a few points before we start. The copies of today's presentation, there will be a portal created by Kelvin and Edwarda and the team, and that will be made available to all participants. Relevant papers and literature will be shared. I've used Canva to put this deck together as well. So most images are sourced there, in case people are wondering. Any that I haven't sourced for you there, I will have the source shown on the slide. So if at any stage you have questions or comments, please jump in at any stage. The more interactive this is, the better. And don't be shy, just come in, because I actually can't see the screen there. Edwarda and Kelvin are running that side of things. So if you want to put your hands up or whatever, or jump in, the lads will keep an eye on that. So Even Dead Fish Go with the Flow, what's with a title? And this title actually came to me, I think it's Roy Keane, for any of you who are soccer fans, or football, as they call it in the UK. Roy Keane is an Irish player, and he would have played with Manchester United. And he had this saying that even dead fish go with the flow. In other words, you can be taken just like with the masses, but to show resilience, you kind of have to go against the current sometimes, and that might take more effort, it might take more energy, but in the long run, actually, to put your heads above water and looking at like longevity and looking at sustainability and resilience, that's necessary. So this is about actually jumping up to zoom up and out and get a view of the bigger picture, and to see, right, what's actually going on here across the board, and try and get a feel for that. So that's why I actually call my own business Upstream. It's about going against the current, not for the sake of it, but actually with a view to actually developing resilience and just more sustainability for the future. So I suppose before we start, I'd like to get a feel, because it's good to know your audience, how familiar people are, attendees are with complexity theory. So I think Edwarda is going to share a link with you there now, right? So if you wouldn't mind, it should only take a minute to actually fill this in. And this is our starting point, and we'll see the responses there as they come in. So, and it's just asking, what I mean, how familiar are you with complexity theory? What's the one question you'd like to have answered? And where in the globe are you joining from? And if you want it, you can leave your name. You don't have to, it's optional. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute there to look at that. I take it you've that shared, Edwarda. Yeah, I can see there's responses coming in here now. Okay, so we have one person coming in saying that they're not at all. We have two people not at all. Okay. We have somebody who's very familiar. Okay. Somewhat. Okay. So we have 5 responses coming in there. Different applications. Cool. So how many have we with us today, guys? Give it a few more seconds for those to come in.
Yeah, you got about 14.
Okay, we'll give another 20 seconds or so there for those to come in. Cool. So we can see here, look, the majority of people are not familiar with it at all. Okay, we have that's 6 people. We have 2 saying they're somewhat familiar, and 1 person is saying they're very familiar. So I'm hoping now that I won't catch myself out here with this person who's very familiar. I hope they'll be kind. What is the one question you'd like to have answered on leaving today's masterclass? I don't know what to ask yet. This is all brand new. Complexity into practice. So definitely at the end, you'll have one tool anyway that you can take with you, and you could be curious about another. So different applications of complexity theory, the balance between protocol guidelines and building resilience, adaptability, healthcare operating environment. Okay. Familiar with systems theory, would like to know how complexity is similar and different, and how to apply this to work. Okay. We're in the globe, so we have Australia, Melbourne, Sunshine Coast, Sydney, UK. Okay, that's cool. 1 person from the UK, and the rest are all down under. So, and that's who we have with us today. So that gives us a feel for where people are at, which is great. So thank you very much for that. So I'm actually going to do introductions just a little bit later on. So if you can bear with me for that. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to look at what do we mean by complexity, and there's many different types. We're going to look at 3 different types of systems, which will lead us in then to the Cynefin framework. So then we're going to look at a practical working through a complexity method that can come in. This is something that you can take back to your workplace and actually try it with your own teams and see what comes out of it. And then I'm going to have a look at working with stories via SenseMaker. So giving you look at that and what that might look and feel like, and then some useful heuristics and some time for Q&A as well towards the end. So I suppose what we're delving into today is making sense of complexity in order to act. Because the theory in and of itself, it's fascinating, it's brilliant, but we want to make sure that we're not paralyzed by it and we feel that we can't take those steps, you know. So this is about actual practical application. What does it mean? What are we mindful of? What are the little things that we can do to try and make further sense, you know, to have that bit of sense making in our organizations that will bring about tangible improvements. So understanding complexity and knowing how best to navigate it, that will aid our decision making, and in so doing, hopefully enable favourable outcomes. So we will look at working with stories as well and how that can help with making sense of complexity as well. Okay, and the whole stories piece, a lot of the work I do revolves around working with stories, and people can look at you sideways sometimes because they think that you're looking for a beginning, middle and an end and spinning a good yarn. But it's actually what can come out of stories is really, really powerful, because people share in stories information that they think is common knowledge to everybody else, whereas actually a lot of the time it isn't. So what will come out in stories can be really interesting nuggets for others to learn in the organisation of the realities and the blind spots that are within organisations if we use some of the methods, one of which will be presented here today, and it can be really valuable to actually tap into that. So what do we mean when we say complexity? All right, because there's a whole lot of schools of thought out there and specialised areas of complexity. So this was a map of the complexity sciences that was revealed in 2018. It was published a few years back. So you can see here, going from the left-hand side here, we can see from the 1940s, 50s, we're going up chronologically and up to the 2020s. So the complexity I'm looking at here is applied complexity. And you can see here, Dave Snowden, organizations and applied complexity. We can just zoom in here and see it there. And for any of you that want to check that out, the link is there as well, you know. So it's basically what we're talking about is anthro-complexity, which is complexity science applied to human systems, okay? Because going back here again, you can see we're looking at cybernetics, there's physics, computation, there's a whole load of stuff out there. Some of this historical stuff feeds into what's here today when we're looking at applied complexity and anthro-complexity. But we won't be covering, you know, if we're looking at the Santa Fe Institute and they look at complexity, it's not that side of things. We're actually here looking at complexity applied to human systems. So it's naturalizing sense making, applying natural sciences to social sciences here to try and make sense of our organizations. So basically, as I was saying, anthro-complexity applies complexity theory to human systems. Okay. So here's an excerpt from the Cynefin book, and it says, the study of complexity as it is experienced in human systems, rather than mechanistic or natural, the animal and geological systems. So human systems have a higher degree of complexity for many reasons, including, for instance, the different behavioral patterns that identity structures create and how they act within different contexts. And if we think about that, you know, it's really interesting as human beings, like this prefrontal cortex and how we think about how we think. It just brings an extra dimension, an extra layer of complexity, and how we behave or interact in work and how we might interact in our home place or with our local, you know, sports club, or if we're out campaigning for something that we feel passionate about. We can be different agents in a system depending on where we are. You can take us out of one system, we can go into another, and we can actually, that ritual, that change in identity, you know, can be quite, they can be quite different, you know, when we actually look at that. So when we look at humans, systems, then I suppose we're not here talking about cybernetics, we're not talking about algorithms and stuff. We're not talking about ants. As I mentioned earlier, humans are, you know, we have more complexity to us. So we're looking at, why do human systems have a higher degree of complexity? So this is what anthro-complexity is looking at. So I suppose art and music came before language in human evolution. So art is of criticality to our intelligence and our resilience as well. And here is an example of a drawing that was found in some caves in northern Spain. So this ancient symbolic cave art, it shows our cognitive capacity. So before we could talk, we were drawing, we were playing music. And yet when you look at our modern day workplaces, there's so much emphasis on, logical system, and how we lay things out. But actually the aesthetics and the art piece is really, really important, because that's how we make sense. That's how we made sense of the world before we had procedures and policies, was actually via looking, and making sense of the world by our instincts, our original instincts there. So it's not to, dismiss that, like it's really, really important. And the next thing is we move up a level of abstraction. So things can combine and recombine in different ways. So we actually can apply something we have learned in one sphere, in one space. We can come into another one, and we can actually join the dots of those. And that's why it's really good when we go working with stories or bringing people together to create data, to kind of cross-pollinate some of this data. What you can get coming out of this, like, is the penicillin discovery. And we look at the creation of the microwave. A lot of the innovations are actually taking something from one space and applying it to another, just via that sense making, saying, oh my God, I can apply that here actually. And that could be very helpful. So that level of abstraction is unique as well to human beings, where we can combine and recombine in different ways. And as I mentioned earlier, humans switch between identities as well. So it's just to bear that in mind, what we might think, like, and if you look at the start of COVID, and even with vaccines, and they can be quite topical, we will create this and that will solve that problem. And we can see actually it doesn't, because people behave in ways that we mightn't expect them to behave. So this can happen in our organizations. Some of you here today, I've no doubt, work in health and safety. And historically, the power of stories, and how people interact in their workplaces can really shape how they will interact. You could come in with the best program, some new program that's really going to help. But because of the historical narrative that is there, it just prevents people from actually interacting as well. So it's just to bear that in mind. It can be hugely powerful as well. So the switch between identities can really hold sway over how we actually interact and behave in systems. So the last point I want to make here is assemblages. So stories get shared and over time beyond the individual creator. And I suppose if you look at our modern times, we look at fake news, like there is so much out there, and it can just snowball, so we can have some of this stuff happening for the good and some of it for the bad as well. But some of this stuff just becomes part then, and it actually really shapes and holds influence over what we do. So I have one example coming up here. Does anybody know what's in this image? Anybody recognize what this circular space is here in the middle of this field? Anyone want to hazard a guess? This is a picture taken in Ireland, by the way, and please feel free to jump in if anyone has any ideas, or if you want to put them in chat. Kelvin and Eduardo, you might call it out there if anyone puts anything in.
Is that a Stone Age barrow of sorts?
Stone Age barrel, is it?
Barrow, yes, underground.
No, it probably does predate that even, I'd say, here in Ireland. It's actually a fairy fort, right? Have many of you heard of fairy forts? Is that a thing in Australia? I'm not sure if it's a thing in the UK, but Ireland is full of fairy forts, and you have these big masses of fields with these circles with hawthorn trees going around them, and farmers, for love nor money, will not touch these fairy forts, because stories are that if you go near a fairy fort, it's really bad luck, that's where the fairies live. Now, you could be laughing and chuckling to yourselves there, saying, here now, 2021, they're talking about fairies in Ireland. But this is the power of narrative and how it can get handed down via generations. And there are examples, they're probably urban myths now at this stage, but it still holds sway over what people do today, whereby some farmers that went and cut this down, and they thought it was a load of baloney, and actually some awful thing happened to their family, or somebody got sick, or somebody got died, or there was a terrible accident, or people just won't touch them. It's just bad luck. They would rather you know, with that superstition, work around it, let the cattle go into it, do whatever, but do not cut down those trees. So for anybody from outside coming in, this can look like it makes absolutely no sense. And oftentimes, if we go to another culture, be that to another country or to another organization, it makes no sense just looking at something like this when you don't have the context. But actually, once you get the context, then it makes sense and you can say, right, okay. Now, if we're looking with this dynamic, we can see why maybe it has to stay this way, or maybe if we do want to change it, how might we change that? But there is real power in those stories, in those rituals, once we have the context around that, you know, and they can really shape what we do today. And that happens in our organizations a lot because of the historical stuff. This isn't like, and there is stuff out there in relation to fairy force written down, but if you go to your organization, there will be lots of stuff that's not written down, the norms, the everyday stuff, but it shapes what people do and what they won't do. You know, it's the stuff that lies underneath. So via the stories, we can kind of tap into some of that stuff that people take that as a given. You know, that everybody knows this when actually everybody mightn't, you know. Anybody have any comments on that? No, you're happy to move on. Cool. But I know some people are fascinated, and sometimes with students when I present various cases, some examples in Africa of bringing over mosquito nets, you know, which are then used for fishing and creating a bigger problem. It's like, oh, that's obvious. That wouldn't have solved that problem. But it's like, actually, hang on. We didn't actually take on board the context of the people and why it made sense for them to do this, you know, and without doing that, it's just a missed opportunity. We really kind of have to tap in to the various players and agents in the system to try and make sense of how they see things before we actually create actions, because so many times we see a lot of money being thrown at stuff without consultation and doing that prep work at the start. And then you see a lot of money going down the Swanee because you realize it actually won't work. Do you know what I mean? We didn't actually consider this. Whereas in hindsight, it looks very obvious as to why it wouldn't work. But in advance, that's the thing with complexity. You can't tell what will or what won't work. So I have another example here of a story. Okay, now this is are any of you familiar with Listowel Varna in County Clare? We have one person in the UK. They might be. We have some people from Australia. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. But in the month of September in Listowel Varna, which is on the west coast of Ireland, there's a month-long festival that's on, and it's known as the biggest singles event in Europe. Now, this is where loads of people go down to Listowel Varna, they descend on it, and it's just, it goes on for the month. There's dancing at early in the morning, it goes on till late at night into the early hours. And some people go down there seriously looking for husbands and wives. Other people just go down for the crack. They just go down for the fun of it, you know. So I've gone down several years with a friend of mine. So one year we went down and it was the last weekend and it was really quiet, and you've all these kind of old codgers that will be there at this event, you know. So in the various pubs and in hotels around the place, the dance halls. So we went down and one guy asked me up to dance. Okay, so he was old character, you know, and it's always mannerly to go and dance if you're asked to dance. And so we went out anyway. So as we were dancing around, you know, the guy turned to me and he says, "You're very fat." And I just thought, oh my God, you know what I mean? How rude is this guy? So I was like, okay, Cam, you do all this mindfulness work. Do you know what I mean? Take a breath, watch the gap, don't go into the free fall here. So I was like, I gave it a minute or so, and then I said, you shouldn't be saying that to somebody, you know. The guy was half deaf now, to be fair, you know. So I was like, you shouldn't say that to somebody. It's quite rude. You shouldn't say to somebody they're very fat. You could ruin somebody's night or what have you. And he said, I said you're very fast. So with the Irish accent, I was very fast. I wasn't very fat. So what I took from that was, okay, I've done all this mindfulness work, and yet I could have gone away home and cried for the next month about even the old codgers are telling me I'm very fat. Or actually, you know, try and make sense of actually what's really happening here and take what's coming out of it. So it's just, I'm telling you the story here now because you might actually knock a kick out of that and say, okay, that's, you know, that's funny and how it could have gone pear-shaped. I've told lots of people since and they've laughed a lot about it. But you might share that story with other people down along, but the story will change as it actually it goes. And it'll probably go beyond me, you know what I mean? And somewhere along the line, it could be somebody from, you know, God knows where, sharing who was the character in that story. But if it has enough weight, it'll actually, it will carry on. So we see that with stories actually in our every day. We see how they carry on, So I just shared that. I thought it was an interesting way of showing how stories can actually, I've been told by people that has been shared far and wide, and I'm sure you all have plenty stories yourselves. So now I'm actually going to go into the introductions, and I'm going to ask you to tell us something unique or unusual about yourself on Jamboard. So Eduarda is actually going to share that Jamboard with us now. So if you wouldn't mind actually putting something in there in relation to that. So I can see some of you are joining there now. So here, if any of you have used Jamboards before, there's a sticky note here, and you can type up here. I'll just put in ABC, and you can save, and the sticky note is there, and you can move it wherever you want to move it. So you could just type in, tell us something unique or interesting about yourself. So just get a post-it there. Oh, very good. We have somebody who keeps bees. I'll delete that one. Bring that over here. We have a tech enthusiast. Very good. Very interesting. I live on a boat. I build sets for a community amateur theatre company. Cool. I have been to the restaurants at the beginning and the end of the world. I'm interested in hearing about that now. I'm intrigued. I make quilts. Fabulous. All very intriguing, to be fair. So we have 7 here now. I cut down a tree the weekend, found native bees in it this afternoon. I have now saved them. Fabulous. Brilliant. All important stuff. Does anybody want to jump in here and actually tell us a bit about this? I have been to the restaurants at the beginning and the end of the world. I'm curious as to where these are. Whoever put that in, do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, that was me, Marion.
I picked a good one, Kelvin.
Yeah, Kelvin Genn. And the restaurant at the beginning and the end of the world are in Penang in Malaysia. And one side of the island is the restaurant that's at the beginning of the world, and on the other side of the island is the restaurant at the end of the world. And the restaurant at the end of the world is probably the most unusual and probably the unusual, some of the best food, and the most challenging place I've ever eaten.
Wow, fascinating. I never realised that, to be fair. So cool. Thanks for sharing that. Somebody else want to jump in here? The person who cut down a tree on the weekend and found native bees and has saved them?
That was me. I just saw that I didn't have anything to talk about, and I saw someone say they keep bees. I was like, hang on a tick, I found a log this afternoon with native bees coming out, so I cut some timber and put it back on because we'd obviously cut their home open a little bit, and yeah, they seem to be happy. So that's my story.
Brilliant. And you didn't have to call in any experts or anything that they didn't?
The native ones, we have a little and they don't sting. But I did call a guy and say, hey, what can I do? So,
brilliant.
Saving lives.
Fair play to you. It's important stuff at the minute. Excellent. Very good. Thank you. I live on a boat. I'm intrigued to hear from this person.
That's me, Marion. Bryn. Due to the housing situation in Hobart and Tasmania, I decided to do something a little bit different. So I live on a 55-foot yacht. Yeah, various advantages. If I don't like my neighbours, I can move. Disadvantages of the weather. Sometimes it's 60 knots and it's blowing a gale in the marina. But yeah, it's all good and interesting.
Fabulous for sunrise and sunset. I'd say you probably get the best. Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And a lovely part of the world to be based in as well, to be fair.
Yeah.
I've never been, but hopefully someday.
Uh-huh.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Cool. The tech enthusiast. You want to come in and tell us what tech in particular?
Yeah, Mary, that's me. Probably more towards the the software aspects of it. I'm interested in different software programs and stuff like that. It's just really a pastime thing. I'm not a full-time job. And also the games aspect as well. So, I got kids as well. They're looking at different games and things like that. So I'm always interested in some of the up-to-date games.
Brilliant. Very good. Cool. Thanks for that. Excellent. Who else have we? I'm an amateur writer. I'm intrigued here.
Hi, Marion. I'm Anthony. I'm the amateur and very amateur. Fiction, not non-fiction. And I do a fair few competitions.
Okay.
Just to keep myself challenged, really. That's the only reason I do it.
And how big are the pieces that you write?
So I've done a bunch. I have a 250-page novel, and I recently just entered a 750-word competition, and I've done shorter as well.
Brilliant. No, it sounds intriguing. I dipped my toe in the water earlier in the year. There's an Irish writer called Marion Keyes who had she gave a week-long kind of course. It was 2 weeks trying to get people into creative writing, and I absolutely loved it. They were only short 500-word pieces, but and I shared them with friends on Facebook, and some people actually reached out to me like in tears. It's gas what you can tap into with that creativity and that story piece, So well done. Brilliant. We're intrigued. You'll have to share some of your work with us now afterwards.
Thank you. That's much too shameful.
No, brilliant. No, I don't think so. Great pastime. Fair play. Very good. And we have somebody here who builds sets for a community amateur theatre company.
Yes, that's me. It's Ian. I actually design and build the sets in conjunction with the producer of the particular play. So can be quite interesting. A chance for a bit of creativity as well.
And good community connection and all that good stuff that comes with it. And the energy, I suppose, as well, of the shows and being a part of that.
Bit of a problem right now with COVID because we can't do a damn thing here.
Yeah, I hear you, in fairness, yes. We've been that way for a long time, but anyway, hopefully time, as they say, hopefully we won't be waiting too much longer. Excellent. Thanks for that. I make quilts. Somebody here?
Yeah, that was me, Jenny. Yeah, I try and make quilts. I'm not particularly creative, but I do my best. And it's one thing that actually COVID has been good for, is you've had plenty of time to do these types of projects. So I've actually managed to get quite a few things finished in the last 18 months, which is nice.
Yeah. And it's gas, actually, you're spot on with COVID. I have an aunt who's knitting jumpers and just people taking up art. I tried my hand at the creative writing, but that stuff, going back to what I was saying earlier, that whole arts piece is really important for us, that whole creativity piece. We really enjoy it, so no, well done. So I think there's an element of people kind of putting themselves down here in relation to writing novels that aren't great and quilts that are only okay. I'm sure they're fabulous. So thanks for that. So we have nothing here. Somebody else who keeps bees.
Yes, that one's me. I've been doing that for about only 2 or 3 years, so definitely an amateur. Definitely one of those things that the more you know, the more there is to know. And really, it's kind of a bit of a balance, because bees have been around for a lot longer than we have and survived for a lot longer than we have. And it's about, how much do you leave them alone and how much do you interfere to help them along the way a bit. So, but it's fascinating. And beautiful. You just have to look at the comb and what they produce. It's incredible.
Yeah, I can imagine. I think we're getting more of an appreciation now with the whole climate side of things as to how important
Yeah.
they are. So you're doing important stuff there as well, to be fair. So there's somebody here who's Australian, whose husband is Scottish, daughter is American, and my son is Australian. So I'd love to be around that dinner table with all the accents anyway. This person want to come off?
Yeah, that's me, Marion, Kylie. My husband is Scottish. I met him here in Sydney, but then we lived in Kansas City, Missouri in the US for 4 years, actually working for Pfizer. And my daughter was born there, so she has an American passport. and then we came back to Australia and my son was born. So we have this very mixed group of people.
Yeah, and fabulous. I lived in Sydney myself for a while, actually, many moons ago, and I lived in Kansas very briefly. I was out in Lauren. Yeah, fabulous part of the world as well.
It
so
is.
very. So you've a right good mix there, in fairness, with all the
yes,
accents
we've got a lot of continents covered.
Yeah, excellent, cool. So you cover all the feast days and festivals and what have you. You've a good range.
Yes, we do.
Excellent, cool. Well, thanks for that. At least we got a feel for, you know, who's with us in the group today, which always makes it interesting. So I'm just looking at time now. It's 9:36, and I just think about stories and what people have told. You know, they can be the community glue, really. You know, and what I often find is when we have some, you learn something new about somebody, and if that's within your organization, it can really help to kind of bring people together and see the humanity in each other, you know, just see them beyond the role, beyond the title. And that can be very beneficial. And that method that we'll go through later on, the future backwards, I've had some managers come up to me after that saying, you know, I haven't spoken with my guys in like 14 years. And these are workshops that I ran in Kansas. And they were like, we sat down today and we actually cracked jokes for the first time. It's, you know, I don't care what comes out of this thing, but like the fact that came out of it was brilliant. So, you know, it's really interesting, and it's always encouraging to see what actually comes out of just giving people the space actually to connect, to open up, to learn something new. And then once you start talking about the work, what can come out of that can be really powerful as well. So I suppose today's course is about complexity, okay? So I just want to highlight as well that not everything is complex, you know, so it's just to, there is an order on a certain side of things, you know, and only a certain amount of stuff is complex, but not everything is. So it's about that when we're looking through the complexity lens, it's good to have that appreciation. And I think as we go through the Cynefin framework later on, we will see actually we do have an ordered space as well. And we behave one way in that system, you know, that there's heuristics and how to go about that. But actually, once we're in the complex space, there's different ones, but not everything is in the complex space. So just not to get too caught up on that, even though our world at the minute, it seems like it's so entangled, isn't it? And it's so interconnected when we look at the last year or so with COVID and all the things that have come to the surface. It's interesting. So I just want to look at this concept of bounded applicability, okay? So most things have value if we understand the boundaries within which they are valid. And I think we can be kind of quick to dismiss sometimes some of the past tools and methods and theories and philosophies that might have been the case, you know. But if we just look at, you know, the context of where they were at that time, and sometimes where they are, in certain contexts, they actually might be appropriate, you know. So that can make it much more useful if we go into an organization saying, I've learned about all this complexity stuff and all that stuff there now, that's yesterday's news, and there's no better way to lose an audience and to create enemies than to go in with that kind of, you know, that attitude, I suppose. So what you're looking for here is you want to say yes and, not yes but. So it's like, absolutely, I can see where this method or this piece of software we're using or whatever it is actually holds value. But in this context, it's actually really good. But we have to bear in mind, there's this other context as well. And in that space, it probably isn't so good. It actually might be harmful rather than helping us. So it's just about how we actually articulate that and convey it, you know. So I suppose boundaries create coherence, you know, and so it's just like people, you know, are agreed here that it makes sense, like, you know, that something is a certain way, and people like that. They like that, the order that the actual boundaries bring. So by applying this principle, we can help decision makers locate the methods and tools that they have found valuable to date, validate their usefulness within certain boundaries, and show them how they are unhelpful in others. And as I was saying earlier, it's a much less triggering and arrogant approach. So it's just, if we look at bounded applicability, we can look now at what's coming out in relation to, you know, we look at Heinrich and he gets a lot of criticism when we talk about safety. But if we look at it back in the day, he was probably the Decker of the day back in the 1930s. He actually brought a bit of attention to this health and safety lark, which up to then wasn't getting much attention at all. So what he introduced brought about big improvements given the context and the setting of the time. But actually now, as we're in 2021 and we're looking at some of the concepts and how they were presented at the time, they mightn't be that helpful now, but some of them actually might in certain contexts as well. So it's just to bear that in mind and not to be dismissing outright something that people might be invested in for a long time. You could have managers and workers who have built systems and invented a lot of energy, and they can become a bit like children with blankies or favorite toys. They just don't want to let go of them. And so just by bearing the bounded applicability in mind, that can be helpful as well, not to be creating unnecessary enemies as we go. So before we go into the Cynefin framework, it's important to tap on 3 types of systems, because this is actually part of the Cynefin framework, So we look at ordered, chaotic and complex systems, And just as a definition, a system is a group of interacting or interrelated entities that form a coherent whole. So looking at these 3 systems, they operate in different ways, and how we actually manage them and work within them needs to be different as well. So I'm going to go through the 3 of those there now. And just to bear in mind as well that a system is surrounded and influenced by its environment. It's described by its boundaries, structure and purpose, and it's expressed in its functioning. So we can have health systems, we can have like an organization, we can have an IT system, you can have a group, a body of people, and this is how it's actually, it's described by the boundaries, structure, purpose, and expressed in its functioning, okay? So that's just a basic definition of that. So an agent then is anything which acts or has agency within the system. So that can be an individual, a group, a story, an idea, etc. Okay? And an agent can be an identity, an artifact, or it can be a tool, an individual or a tribe or a clan. So when we're talking about agents and system, it's not just people we're talking about here. It can be any of what has been mentioned there as well. So when we talk about complexity, we talk about agents in the system, we talk about boundaries, and that bounded applicability, and we will go through the various layers of those, and I'll have examples, practical examples of each of those as well. Complex systems are dynamic open systems that co-evolve with their environment, and we've seen many examples of this, one of which I'm sure you're familiar with is gin distilleries turning into hand sanitizer factories nearly overnight with the onslaught of the COVID-19, so people will self-organize, they will co-evolve depending on what's happening in the external environment. And we see that happening within our organizations. And there are certain things that we can control internally, and there's other stuff beyond our gates that we can't control. And we have to, for survival, to evolve and to exact, we have to actually change and be dynamic and have that shift within the systems to actually survive. So there's just a short little video here showing, like, even when the environment changes and you have a river that has flooded, you will have salmon actually crossing this river. And it's funny, actually, if you look at the cars, they actually stop nearly as if they know the safe pass code in relation to actually getting across that road as well, So it's just depending on the environment and how it shifts, that will actually, the system will play, and the players and the agents in the system will actually self-organize in relation to that system as well. So I think it can be fascinating to see this actually play out in nature, but it happens in our workplaces as well. So when we look at systems and constraints here, each system is defined by the type of constraint that is either in place or that is absent, okay? So I'm going to go through the 3 of these in detail now. So the fixed constraints here will be in the ordered system. The system constrains the agents, okay? So it just keeps them in an ordered space. They're tightly constrained. So a chaotic system then has no constraints. So agents are unconstrained, and there's no effective constraints for that. And a complex system, then you have enabling constraints. So we tend to think of constraints as being negative, but actually they can be positive. You can have enabling constraints. And what they do is the system lightly constrains the agents, but agents modify the system through their interaction. Okay. So I'm going to go through examples of these here now. So when we talk about fixed constraints in an ordered system, okay, so we're saying here the system constrains the agents. So the constraints are so high that all behavior is predictable. Okay, so we can see here, you know, it's a car manufacturing line, and it's like, the predictability here is quite high. There will be breakdowns and there will be the occasional bit of maintenance, but for the most part, this is a predictable process line, and it's actually highly automated, as we can see. So this is an ordered system. Now, the energy it takes to create this ordered system, the cost of this is actually quite high, and we can't do this across the board, you know, in all our organizations. Once we get that order, it can be very beneficial when we're looking at productivity and getting things out the door. But the cost in getting that and the energy required to get that is quite high. So chaotic systems, then, when we look at those, they have no constraints. So the agents are unconstrained and there are no effective constraints. And I remember, Kelvin, chatting with yourself last year when you had your fires in Australia. And that time you're saying all we can do now is pray. We're just like, you know, the engineering and out and stuff.
There's nothing that we could do but wait for rain, I think, at that point.
That was it. Yep. So we're just praying for rain here, like, because that's the only thing that can actually help us in this instance. So, you know what I mean? So there are no constraints here within these systems, you know, and it's just chaos. You try and get a bit of order on it to bring it back to a space where there's some bit of order, you know, and try and learn from that for the future. But some of this stuff, especially when you're looking at climate change, it can be chaotic. We've seen it in Germany this week. I'm not sure how many people have been killed at this stage with flooding. In China, there was flooding this week. There's huge temperature surges in, you know, Western Canada. I know here this week we're having a heat wave. I think it's frosty in Australia at the minute, is it, in parts of New South Wales? I saw somebody posting -7 degrees or something, and we're up at 30 degrees here at the minute. It's just a bit bizarre, you know. But in this chaos then, so it's just, as I said, there aren't any effective constraints for that. And that's where a lot of our emergency services and stuff are, you know, that they're actually trying to bring a bit of order to it. But there aren't constraints. So if we looked in at complex systems, here we have enabling constraints, okay? So the system lightly constrains agents, but the agents modify the system through interaction. So what I have up here now is a picture. It's Ohio University, and you can see the footpaths here. So actually, prior to designing the footpaths, because you know sometimes how we have these, we will design a nice linear footpath, and then we have these desire lines, as people call them, where people just cut across the grass. What they done in Ohio University was they just left the whole thing blank, and they watched where students actually were walking, and they laid the paths down then on top of that. So it's kind of an enabling constraint. This would have been the original here on the right-hand side, you know. So we can create these enabling constraints, and that can actually come out of some of our safe-to-fail experiments or safe-to-fail probes that we might design based on where our system is at. And I'll talk a little bit more on that later on. But they're just the 3 types of systems, I suppose, and the types of constraints that you will have there in relation to that. So the Cynefin framework then, we're saying it's a useful tool that helps us make sense of complexity in order to act. And it helps us understand complexity and navigate uncertainty, aiding our decision making, and in so doing, enabling favourable outcomes. Okay, so when I think about it, the first time, as I say, I came across this was 2015, and it was just after I'd done a course with Sidney Dekker in the Netherlands in the summer of that year, and he'd mentioned Dave Snowden and the Cynefin framework. So I had often done a masterclass on that later that year. But it just shifted how the lens through which I actually look at the world around me. It's not just work, it's everything, you know, and looking at the interconnectedness of it, like, you know. So it's a real help to us to navigate this uncertainty in certain times, and to know that certain things are beyond our remit. You know, that we have to try and make sense of it, and we cannot do it on our own. When we're looking at complex problems, we have to involve various agents in the system, various players, be they employees, be they, you know, suppliers, contractors, and by taking on board those perspectives and learning from that, then actually trying to make sense of what's happening, and then try to develop some small actions. But we'll do a little bit on that there later on. So when we look at the Cynefin framework then, and we look at systems, I've mentioned ordered, the complex and the chaotic. This is how they fit onto this Cynefin framework. So for any of you that mightn't have heard of the Cynefin framework before, I'm hoping that this is kind of bringing about what I've presented there on the 3 systems and kind of visualizing where they reside. But this ordered side is actually split into 2. And that's based on, if we look at what actually is the reality, and that's ontology. If we look at, you know, the perception that we have of what's out there, the epistemology, and then the knowledge that we have, you know, as well, that's divided into 2 parts here, the ordered system. So what we end up with here is clear and complicated, okay? So that's your ordered system on the right-hand side. There is order there, but there's different levels of order. And in the middle, it's confused. A lot of people would say that Cynefin framework has 4 quadrants. It doesn't. It has 5 domains, okay? And in the middle, you have confused. And sometimes we would start here saying, I don't know where we are. But I have useful heuristics there as a rule of thumb when you come to say, look, where are we? That can come in helpful for that. So I'm going to go through each of those domains there now as well, okay, in relation to trying to navigate that and see where it can be helpful for us, okay? So I just want to give a shout out as well here to Sue Borchardt, who actually would have done all these drawings here as part of the Cynefin book. So the link is there for Sue's Patreon. If you look at it there, she does fabulous sense making on various complexity topics, and she presents them graphically, and they're really good. So by all means, check out her work. But just so that you know, the graphics that are presented here were created by Sue as well. So I suppose the first thing I want to look at is cause and effect. Okay, and this is the one thing. If there's anything else that you take from today, and you're looking at the Cynefin framework and the lens, this is the one thing I think that's really important, and the one that's worth you know, bearing in mind. So if we look in the clear domain, so here in this domain, clear cause and effect relationships are apparent to everyone involved. Okay, it's obvious. This used to be called simple, and then it was called obvious, you know, this domain. So this is whereby, you know, the constraints are such here in the cause and effect, on and off, you know what I mean? It's on, everyone has agreed the light comes on. It's off, everyone agrees the light comes off. You know, it's just it's obvious to most reasonable people that this cause and effect relationship is, you know, if you put your hand over a flame, you're going to get burnt. You know, if you push the pedals on the bike, it's going to bring you forward. A lot of that, you know, very obvious stuff. It belongs there in the clear domain. Now, if we go up to the complicated domain, and bearing in mind, again, the 2 of these are in the ordered system space, there's a clear relationship between cause and effect, but it may not be visible to everyone, okay? So the example I have here is somebody with a broken down car, okay? So while changing a tire, it might be obvious to some people, to others, it's actually complicated. It's not that, you know what I mean? It's not visible to everyone. If my car breaks down and there's a problem underneath the bonnet, lots of people might actually know what's what, and they might recognize the symptoms. I wouldn't have an iota. So to me, I'm absolutely oblivious, and, you know, so it's complicated here, you know. So the cause and effect relationship, it's absolutely there, but it's only visible to kind of experts in the system, okay? So if we look at the complex domain then, so the cause and effect can be deduced only with hindsight, all right? And what I've put in here actually are these frogs that were, or these toads that were brought into Australia. I can't think of the name of them again. They were introduced in the late 1800s, the early 1900s.
Cane toads.
Cane toads, yeah. They're nasty little bits of stuff.
Or Queenslanders by another name.
Yeah. But whereby, you know, in hindsight, it's like, what did you do bringing these in here? But the intentions were good at the start of it, you know. Whereby, let's bring these in, they'll solve this problem, but without consideration for the bigger problem that they might create, you know. So the cause and effect can be deduced only with hindsight. So this is where you kind of have consideration. I mentioned earlier on about mosquito nets that were brought into a certain part of Africa. Lots of well-meaning, well-intentioned, well-educated people coming in to do good and to solve a problem here of malaria in this part of the world, you know. And they sent out all these mosquito nets. And actually, when they found then that people were using them as volleyballs, as volleyball nets, they were using them to fish the waters. And actually, they were now depleting the fish stocks with what they were doing. So looking in hindsight, you're saying, here now, sure, did they not realise? But actually, from the outset, the best of intentions, didn't realise this was going to be the result. So we can always look back, and this is what happens in health and safety. We look back with that retrospective, that bias that we have, and we have all these counterfactuals of what shoulda, coulda, woulda happened. And obviously the person themselves that's involved knows this. But how many times do we see it play out in our societies? We have voting machines here in Ireland whereby millions were spent on them. They're above in some warehouse now because they didn't involve the various agents in the system, the various players, to see how it worked. And there was some boo-boo anyway, whereby they wouldn't work because of some requirement. And now they're being left there, but they cost 5 million or something. So we see this a lot in public expenditure. We see it in our organisations. But just to bear in mind, with complex systems, cause and effect can only be deduced in hindsight. They cannot be upfront. So this is whereby we try with small actions, small safe to fail probes. That's what we're talking about here in the complex systems, rather than big solutions that are going to change the whole system. Because sometimes, and we can see that 75% of change programs fail, when you look at them coming into organizations. And this is why out there in literature from McKinsey's and the like as well, So when we go on to the chaotic domain then, so there's no relationship between cause and effect exists. So your primary goal is to establish order and stability. So as I say, this is the climate change stuff. It's in a crisis, It's just you act. Afterwards, you make sense of it and you try and learn from it, bring it into your planning. But the cause and effect, you know what I mean? It doesn't exist. Do you know what I mean? So your goal here is just to establish order and stability. So this is just an oversight of cause and effect. So in the ordered system, it's there. In the clear, it's very obvious. In the complicated, it's only obvious to a few specialized folks. And we see that in some of our health and safety stuff. If we're looking at asbestos, if we're looking at radiation, some people will know, some people won't. You just have to call in the experts. And even if it comes to medical decisions, you might have two doctors, two very specialized people, and they might have two different treatments proposed. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, it doesn't necessarily have to be one right way. There can be multiple ways here, multiple paths that we can go, but there are experts there that can guide us, and we just have to tap into their expertise to try and make a decision here to take action. But the complex, as I say, you have to explore on a small level. You have to involve, make sense of the context with the various players before taking action. And in chaos, just jump into your action, make sense of it later, and learn from it. So your cause and effect just is not apparent at all, as you make your way through that. So there's a piece here on retrospective coherence. And just because, this is from Max Boyso, by the way, and he says, just because you can look back and connect the dots does not mean that you can look forward with the same certainty. There are simply hundreds of points in human systems that are changing dynamically, which does not allow us to use retrospective coherence to predict future risks and or opportunities. Okay, so, and it's something to really bear in mind when we're looking at complexity, when we're looking at our systems. Looking back does not mean that we can predict going forward. Okay, and he actually goes further on this. Max has some fantastic work here, and he looks at the connectivity here of basically number of possible. This is the complexity and the number of possible patterns here with number of dots. So if you had 4 dots, okay, how many numbers of possible links do you think might be there with those? How many times can it actually connect? Anyone want to hazard a guess?
At least 6.
Yeah, you're on the ball. There's 6. You could see it there, 5 and 6. Yeah. So if there was a number of patterns then that were available with that, and that means like it doesn't have to be just in a triangle. It can be in a various shapes. But you'd see that there's 64 actually if you look at the possible patterns that are within that. Okay. So now I'm no mathematic guru, and his paper is there, and that'll be in one of the extra reading if you want to go in and delve into this. But he goes on then, he says, if you've 10 number of dots, how many possible links might you have? You know, and I won't put pressure on anyone for this because I wouldn't have guessed it in a month of Sundays. But he says that you have 45 links, okay? Which is interesting. You're saying that's still quite small. But actually, the number of possible patterns is 3.5 trillion. So, like, if you look at our systems, if we have 10 agents with 45 links, possibly, the number of possible patterns here is 3.5 trillion. If we have 12 dots, possible links 66, and you're going up into quintillions, like. So it's huge, right? Now, for any mathematical gurus out there that want to delve into this, this is his equation that he uses for that, you know. So basically what he's saying here is this whole retrospective coherence. Just because we look back and go, oh, aha, that's why that happened. Sure, like, that shouldn't have happened. We'll make sure that doesn't happen again. Because of the potential number of patterns that are in the system, that might necessarily be the case. Now, as humans, we love order, and we love to think that we can predict based on current and past experience, that we'll predict this ordered state. We love order. We like things to be so in a predictable way. But as we can see in our world at the minute, that has just gone out the window, and it has been very challenging for us as human beings, because the certainty and the order that we would have become used to, you know, it has been up in arms. So it's just interesting to actually watch it play out in, you know, on a big scale, you know. Anybody, any comments on that? Can I move on? But so if we look at decision making then, and we're looking at the Cynefin framework, here we're actually looking at, there's heuristics here that you sense, categorize, respond in the clear domain. Okay, so this is where things are obvious and that cause and effect relationship is clear. Okay, so first of all, you just make sense of, you know, just say you arrive off, if I arrive off the aeroplane and I'm over in the US, okay, I can see everybody is driving on the other side of the road. I categorize it. Okay, the car is, you know, I'm driving, and I'm where the passenger seat is in my own here in Ireland, you know. And the response then is, okay, I just get used to it, and I try and get used to it. But it's clear, it's obvious that I don't drive on the same side of the road as I drive on at home, you know. So in complicated then, here in relation to our sense making, we make sense of something, but we don't categorize it. We actually analyze it, and then we respond. Okay, so we don't have the capacity here to categorize because we mightn't have the information. As I mentioned there with radiation or asbestos or with any specialized part of the work we do, we need to get some expert in relation to that. So once we get their opinion then on possible paths forward, then we respond to that, you know. That's when it's not clear to us. Some things are clear, some are complicated. So when we're in the complex domain, and this is really interesting, this is where we probe first. We don't jump in and make sense at the start, we probe. So how we do that is we actually tap into the perceptions, I suppose, of the various people in the system, try and tap into their knowledge, you know, try and make sense of it, and then try and respond. But that's a collective thing. It's not any one person. One person trying to probe here to make sense of something and responding, they're not going to get the granularity that we need to actually, you know, to have that level of information as to what is really happening in all the nooks and crannies here that we need to be aware of. You need to have multiple perspectives here in this complex system to probe, make sense, and then you respond. And in these safe to fail experiments that you will come with here, you know, in your response, you will have an appreciation in that of what would failure look like, and what could we do to combat that? Have we had some considerations about that? Where are we not willing to go? What are the boundaries here that we're going to put in place? The constraints we're going to put on this, like, you know, maybe it's budgets, maybe it's time, but it's just you have some consideration at that from the outset to make sure that it's safe to fail. And if we see any signs of this that it's going to fail, we pull the plug on it. You know, whereas if it does succeed and we apply it in one part of the organization, where might we amplify that elsewhere? It's worked here. There's no guarantee it will work elsewhere, but you know what? It looks like we might actually try and go the same approach here in this other part of the organization. Let's try it and see. So in the chaotic space, then we act first, we make sense of it afterwards, you know, and we respond then by actually tweaking our systems for future, in the hope that we can try and prevent some of the chaos again. But that's not always the case. And as I say, a prime example here is the when we're looking at climate change. So constraints is the next part I want to go on to here. So in CLIAR, we're talking about fixed constraints. So these can be like if you're baking a recipe, stick to this recipe, you'll get that result. Do you know what I mean? For the most part, if you stick to that, you use the right temperature, the right quantities and stuff, you'll get the same cake or buns or whatever it is that you're actually baking with your recipe, you know. In complicated then, you're looking at governing constraints. And here, we're actually looking here, just like if you're driving along a motorway, dual carriageway, you know, there's governing constraints, there's lines on the road, but you could actually overtake at certain parts, you know what I mean? They're not fixed per se. You can actually go along those, even if you're on just a 2-lane road, and you know, and if there's something blocking the way, you can go into, it's not a fixed constraint, you can go into the next lane and move around, but they're governing. So the enabling constraints then in the complex domain, and an example would be our knee joint that enables us to function, to actually move. So it enables us to function and to walk, you know. So in that regard, it's an enabling constraint. So seeing this actually play out in organizations, sometimes you might see trying to build teamwork between departments. An enabling constraint might be we're looking any 2 members from each of these 2 teams who want to go out and have lunch together, you know, there's a certain amount of, there's a voucher there for lunch, you know, to build relations. So this is an enabling constraint, you know, to bring people together. There's lots of different examples of whereby this can be introduced in an organizational setting. So in the chaotic domain, then there is no effective constraint there. So I suppose it's important to realize that the notion of a constraint is not a negative one. It is not something which merely limits possibilities. Constraints are also enabling, okay? So by eliminating certain possibilities, others are introduced. So constraints provide a framework that enables descriptions to be built up around it. So when dealing with complexity, though, these frameworks cannot be fixed, okay? They are constantly being transformed, and therefore our models will always be provisional. You always have the agents in the system, they're pushing boundaries. We always push boundaries, and you see that in human systems, you know. But it's just to remember that constraints, they're not necessarily negative. They can actually be positive. They can be enabling constraints, okay? So the practices that we have there then are down in the CLIAR domain, you have best practice. So this is actually, it's tried and tested. It's cause and effect, you know, it's like your fixed constraint. This is actually that we know that this is the best way to do this job. You know, it's repetitive and anyone can actually repeat the stuff. And this is where our best practice comes in. And in that context, best practice is actually very beneficial. In the complicated domain, then we have good practice. Okay, so it's not actually this just one best way. It's actually, there are multiple ways we can do it, but it's good practice to go this way. So over here in the complex domain, then we have exaptive practice. So this is actually via our safe to fail probes, we are exapting as we go. You know what I mean? The system is morphing, it's changing based on these small little changes that over time can actually lead to big changes collectively. There we go. And then in the chaotic space, here what we have is novel practice. So sometimes what can come out of that actually can be really novel, and that can actually feed in down the line and for future there as well. So there are the layers. I know that has been quite heavy going through the Cynefin framework. I wanted to go through the basic, like, you know, the decision making, the practices, the domains, you know, the constraints, and then to try and layer them up on top of each other, you know, so you can actually see, because it can be quite, there's a lot in it, you know, and that's just kind of touching on the basics. There's a whole space where you can look at liminal spaces between each of the domains and what have you. But I think as a foundation, I think that gives a good feel for what each of them are, and that's it represented here. You know, if you just want to print something off, it's like do you know what, this is what the various domains are. And in the middle here, you can see the AC. We said confused. That has been split since again. That's aporetic and confused, but I'm not going to bamboozle you know by actually going into that. There's a huge amount of information out there on the Cognitive Edge webpage. Dave Snowden updating this Cynefin framework, you know, so and tweaking it. So there's plenty more to be learned from that. But that's good. But also what's actually good, if you look at simplified heuristics, I mentioned that earlier on, if you want to decide what context am I in, you know you're in the clear domain if somebody knows what to do and everybody agrees, okay? You're kind of in the clear domain, right? Someone can figure out what to do. Everyone doesn't have to agree, but there are a few options, just in case I decide which option. Complicated domain. No one can figure out what to do, and evidence supports conflicting hypotheses, right? So now we're in the complex domain. So someone must do something now, and stabilization is most important. That's the chaotic domain. So this can be really helpful if you're saying, where am I at all? Because often we start here in this confused space in the middle. You know, so it's like, actually, do you know what? Let's use these heuristics. They're really helpful. Someone can figure out what to do. I can't do it. To me, I'm getting bamboozled, but actually there's somebody out there who's, you know, expert in this space. Let's call them in. We might get a couple of opinions how to proceed, and let's go with that. So it just helps you to kind of place yourself. And we can see, if we go back, we can look here at the how you actually respond in each will be different. You will sense, analyze, respond if you think you're in that complicated space or if you know you're there. Whereas actually, if you're in the complex space, you know you have to do something different. You're not going to make sense initially. You're going to probe. So that's really important. But that can be a very useful kind of a, I won't say a cheat sheet, but useful heuristics there to help you to place yourself on the Cynefin framework. So one thing to bear in mind as well, the boundary between clear and chaotic, this is not like this one-dimensional system. This actually is, it's like a steep cliff here between clear and chaotic. And it's like, it's one that's not visible to you. If you get too complacent here in this clear domain, and you take things to be a certain way and they'll always be that way, and you're pushing boundaries by making things to be clear, you know, that you actually need to tweak and keep an eye on, you can fall over that cliff and you can fall into chaos as well. So it's to bear that in mind. So I'm just going to show you here on the next slide. This is a 3D version of the Cynefin framework. Okay, Martin Berg, Christopher Bramley, and Rob England actually created this graphic, and it's really good. And this is the 3D version. So I'm just going to zoom in here for you, okay, on this. So if we look up here, as we were saying earlier on, in this clear domain, this actually takes a lot of energy. Look how high up it is. To get up here takes a lot of energy. There's a lot of money and cost and resources required to get here. To go up here where the robots are takes extra costs again, you know what I mean, if you're going to go into that automotive space. But you can actually see here, once you come near to that cliff, you can end up in chaos. You know, you can fall over that cliff and down you get, you know what I mean, and you're trying to scramble your way out of there then quickly. You can see a little bit, you go down if you're going to the complicated domain from clear. So this is where there isn't as much energy required, still quite an amount of energy, but here is the domain of the experts. Do you know what I mean? So this is where the expert toolbox is. Once they have a recipe created, they can maybe bring it up here to the clear domain. So here then you could actually go down the steps here into the complex, the unknown, and this is where your experimentation piece is. And your hope really with anything that you undertake, any work in the complex domain, is to bring yourself back up to the complicated. So you might be doing this merry dance whereby you're going through the two, trying your experiments, trying to see what are the cause and effect relationships here. You know, is there such a way that we can make a good practice out of this, you know, that you might bring it up here and keep it in that space? There's no guarantee of that, but that's kind of what your hope is. And we can see over here the chaos then between complicated and chaotic. You know, there's a slight little gradient between those. But some of the methods that we do what we call a shallow dip into chaos, where we take people along this boundary, this confused space here, and you know, we actually try and via the methods just generate data. People end up being a little bit confused by what you're asking to do, but actually at the end of it, you end up coming into this complex space and creating some safe to fail experiments, and you try and bring it around. So that's kind of the cycle we go on. So I'm hoping that has been okay and how it has been presented. If anybody has any questions for that part of it, I'm all ears, before we go on to and we'd finish up. There's another 2 slides before we might finish for a break. I'm not sure of time. We're fixed. Probably time for a break anyway. Will I just do the next couple of slides and we'll go for a break, Kelvin? Yeah.
Well, I think the next 2 slides, then take a break.
Yeah, perfect. So I suppose these aspects influence the difference between clear and complicated in the framework. So I mentioned earlier on what is reality, and that's ontology and how things are, right? We have our perception of reality. That's called epistemology and how we perceive things. And the knowledge then is phenomenology. Sorry, no, my description isn't the best, and how we know things. So this is actually what breaks down the difference between the clear and the complicated domain. And a lot of the times, this is some of the language I'm talking about that people get a bit turned off when we talk about complexity. Some of you might be very familiar with these terms, some of you might not. So ontology, epistemology, phenomenology, I'm pronouncing it wrong, but just to know what the 3 of those actually mean, and that is what differentiates the clear and the complicated domain as well. So just to recap on the 3 types of systems, we have ordered, complex, chaotic. The ordered are predictable, they're repeatable, there's long foresight, and the whole is the sum of its parts. Okay. In the complex then, dynamic links, semi-stable patterns, there's real-time feedback, and the whole is not the sum of its parts. And then if we look at the chaotic, there's no effective links, it's temporal, it's hard to maintain, and it's actually volatile. Okay. So that's just a recap where we started on the 3 systems before we imposed them onto the Cynefin framework, went through the layers. So just to go back again to show these are the 3 types of systems. So in relation to where we start in the Cynefin framework, and when we're looking at complexity, this is where we look. So we look at probe, sense, respond. So once we come back after break, then we'll actually start looking at, we'll go into breakout rooms and we'll start looking at that future backwards method. And we'll get some hands-on experience of that, so you can actually have a go of it and partake in it, and then that's something that you can take away with you to go back to your teams and maybe try out in relation to some topic at work. Is that okay, Kelvin?
Yeah, that's great. Let's take a break and resume at 30 minutes past the hour, if that suits everyone.
Cool, excellent. Does anybody have any questions before we finish, or are you okay? The rest of it is going to be a lot more practical, more so than heavy theory, for anyone who's thinking that was a bit heavy. I hope it wasn't too heavy. But I'll see you after the break, guys, okay?
That was good. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Bryn. Cheers.
I'm back in your hands, Marion.
Cool. So I'm guessing everybody is back at this stage. So what we're going to do here now is we're going to actually go and join Concept Board. So Edwarda, have you the link for that, or will I put it in myself?
Sorry, let me just stop presenting.
And I will start presenting here at my screen. So, okay, I'll go back here. Sorry, I'm in the wrong direction. All right. So Edward is going to share a link there, okay, to actually get in here to Concept Board, all right? So this is what will actually appear up on your screens. So yeah, she has it in there now, okay? Because I suppose what we've touched on here is where we're going to start in a complex system is we have to probe, make sense, and respond. So with that in mind, we want to get various perspectives of the players in the system. Okay, so this is something that you can actually replicate for within your organizations. So it's with a view to joining the dots and basically lighten up those blind spots, those dark spots within the organization to enable us to act. So the Future Backwards is one of the tools in the toolbox. There's plenty more there, but it's one that can be really, really helpful. And So it's just, we're just going to jump in with that now, right, and actually get cracking. So it's a mapping and a narrative landscape. That's basically what we're going to be doing here. So let me see now, have you all joined on board? You have. So you can see here now. Yeah, there's plenty of people here with me. So yeah, I can see Eduarda's here moving. So if you can actually make your way, as you can see here on the screen, see the bottom left hand screen, there's one square here. So it brings you up here to this part here. It's towards the top of the screen, upstream and art of work. And this will actually, if you move about that screen, yeah, you can see Bryn is just to the left of the screen there now when you look at it. Peter, Kelvin, you're coming down. Kelvin is there. Phil, yeah, Michelle, Eduarda, you're getting there. Yeah, so if people know what groups they're in, then they can actually go to that board. So I'm going to show people here now. So Eduarda's going to share the link in the chat. But for people who are in group 1, all you do is click on the arrow here for group 1 and it'll bring you to that board, okay? And likewise, if you're in group 2, there's an arrow above it, click that. It'll bring you to this board for group 2. And if you're in group 3, similarly, you just go here and you join, click the arrow for group 3. So do you want to put in who's in what group there, Eduarda, in the chat?
Yep.
Or if people know, please. Thanks. Cool.
1.
So what I'm going to ask people to do here, okay? So we're going to start off, and I have one hexie. We use hexagons rather than actual post-its because people tend to put post-its in nice orderly lines and they compartmentalize stuff. This is more like a beehive, and we have people here today who are very into bees. So we're actually going to try and make it more ecological, more natural, and it can go in any way, shape. There is no order in it as such, okay? So what I'm asking you to do is, we'll see here now, for today, you're asked to think about the current state of our world due to the arrival of COVID-19, okay? Where are we in relation to COVID-19 today? And only today for this part of the exercise. We're not asking you to go back to the past or look to the future. What's going on right now? What's going on in relation to COVID-19, okay? So you bring up one of the hexes, you can just move them around like that. You can type inside them. If you double click them, you can type in whatever you want to type, okay? So I'm just asking you to think about what is the current state of our world due to the arrival of COVID-19? Where are we in relation to COVID-19 today? And we're only looking at today for this part of the exercise. Discuss your thoughts with your team. Capture your points on the hexes provided above, and you can move them around and see if you bring another one up, you can join it in like a beehive, you know, you can do that around, and you just populate away then from there, okay? So you capture your points and move them around the today hexie, and they should only be maximum 4 or 5 words, okay? And you can zoom in if you want to make this bigger, or you can zoom out. So what Eduarda is going to do is actually give you, share the breakout groups with you. Is everybody on their board at this stage? And if you can look there, Eduarda, I've just slightly changed. We've gotten rid of group 3. So if you can see where people are on the board.
Yep.
Can you do that? Yeah?
Okay. So guys, how breakout groups work in Google Meet is I'm going to send you a couple of links to go into your breakouts. They're different meetings. So what you're going to do is first, you're going to mute your microphones on this meeting on the main page. And then you're going to go to the link for your breakouts. Does everybody understand?
That's Rachel, Jenny, Bryn, Michelle, and Peter. Yeah. And breakout room 2, then we have Ian, Phil, Kylie, and yeah, we have 3 in that group. So I'm going to go back here. Have we somebody from group 2 who can actually present on their story, working from the past towards today, and then can tell us about their utopia and dystopia?
We didn't actually speak about that bit, but I'm happy to do it, unless someone else wants to do it.
That'd be great, Philip. Thank you. Drive on.
Okay, so where would you like us to start? From the utopia, working backwards from one of our key points over there?
No, actually start from the past and say these events in the past we believe brought us to where we are today. Potentially this is the impossibly good future. Potentially this is the impossibly bad future. So if you can start from the very start, left hand side there. If you can see my screen, leave it up here, yeah.
Yeah, so it was interesting. One of the points in our orange hexes is something we were looking back and how we could have got to utopia, but it's also something which I guess set us up for failure, and that was maintaining COVID research. Many moons ago, we knew coronavirus was a thing, and due to lack of funding, it wasn't continued. So if we had maintained that, that could have been something which prevented, maybe have prevented something like this. So
Interesting.
So going back to things that set us up for failure, so no vaccine, there's no financial support at the start, so that made, I guess, compliance difficult and people resistant to taking part in it. We had lack of clarity around what needed to be done, and that included at a government level, so a lot of conflicting advice and strategies. Then they brought in financial supports, which was a huge help to a lot of people. But then we had all these other things starting to come into play, these other, I guess, pressures. So if people are asymptomatic, then rules became a disincentive to get tested. So if you're not showing symptoms, but then you go to get tested and you found to be positive, then the impacts it can have on you financially and socially, pretty big. I've got people flaunting the requirements or the controls due to complacency, government dictation as opposed to having society involved and part of the solution. Then we went back to limited financial support again. So we went from no support to plenty of support to limited support. So again, more reason for people to not be participating fully in those rules and regulations. We were overly reliant on compliance. Flawed quarantine was another key point. So I've had a few mistakes there. And that's sort of the past. Is that cool? So go to where we're at today.
Yep.
Okay, so our take on today is that it's unpredictable. The role of leadership is unclear. People are confused, complacent, because we've come out pretty well in Australia compared to a lot of other countries. So people are complacent and doubt the severity of the virus. No end in sight, unsure of what the end game is. Vaccination targets are in there, so we're looking at that. Vaccination solution or problem, so not too sure what the future holds in that regard.
Cool.
And lack of a common message.
Okay, so up to utopia then.
Cool. So utopia, yeah, so we had some interesting conversations around that. So super resistant humans, so we develop and we become better than we have been in battling viruses and bacteria. We learn from our mistakes. We adapt and learn to live with it. We had some government discussions, which is always good, right? So no state governments or one government to eliminate this. So in Australia, we've had all these debates between the states and these different power plays. We get a better vaccine. We get enough vaccination that the virus is actually gone, so we actually get on top of it with something that's effective.
Cool.
That pretty much sums it up.
Dystopia then?
Okay, so health systems overwhelmed, so to the point where we're not actually having any impact on controlling it at all or responding to it. We become unable to control the variants, so it just spreads and morphs into too many things that we can't have any impact on it. The economic impacts are severe, and that leads into the social impacts. So society goes weird, like they do in those movies with dystopia stuff. They go underground and become odd. Vaccines fail, no European holidays, and no Brisbane 2032. So the Olympics are gone.
I see. And you connected to saying, you mentioned that earlier on, how the funding was curbed earlier on as well, and how you worked back, which is interesting as well. So have we somebody, I'm conscious of time here, have we somebody from Group 1 who can do the same and start from the past?
I'll give it a crack, and Michelle can correct me if I've got it wrong. 'Cause, yeah,
No worries.
yeah, yep. Do you... So
So it's
start
just
from the
a brief
past.
run through. Yeah, and Bryn, there'll probably be stuff that's similar. There'll be stuff
Yep.
that's different. So we'll just give it like a few minutes to kind of do the whole lot, if that's okay, because I need to get back to the presentation before we finish. Yep.
Cool. So lack of foresight, how much of the vaccine is needed. Obviously, COVID happened. We had lockdowns. There was a vaccine developed. We had leaders not following the rules in terms of their own lockdown rules. Got the Delta variant emergence, and then can't remember why the Olympics was there. I think that was a Queensland-centric thing. Yeah. So that was the past. And you wanted us to cover today.
Yep. What's going on today?
So I'll start at the centre here. So we had arbitrary border closures, unclear boundaries, house prices skyrocketing, unable to access vaccine, confusing or conflicting messages from different sources. We've got arguments of authority and not using good evidence. One size does not fit all. Good for thee, but not for me. Access to the country. So that was the example of the I think the Queensland Premier leaving the country to do deals for the Olympics and then getting to come back, but when other people couldn't go out to see sick family. Individual value being balanced with the good for the group.
Interesting.
I put in there, government still trying to manage the COVID as a simple or a complex problem and failing. Polarized viewpoints, drive for simple, clear rules, and there's a counterbalancing comment there about desire for autonomy, deflation, exhaustion, depression, and some aspects of chaos.
Okay. So your utopia then?
So utopia, I started to reorganize a little bit to try and make a little sense of it. So flexibility in working arrangements, developments in technology, getting us to a stage where everyone's vaccinated, equality of access to healthcare, healthy globalization, reliability of resources, or availability of resources, i.e. vaccines. COVID goes the way of polio. It's eradicated. People allowed to get on with their lives. Someone wants to win the lotto, and consumption of resources that are mindful of the impacts and they're understood.
Cool. Your dystopia then?
So we got isolation, lack of communication, lack of plurality, paradoxical unintended consequences of both the virus and our government or people's actions, power control, authoritarian or totalitarian, loss of control, I guess. Sorry, not loss of control. Loss of control of power and leading to authoritarian or totalitarian government controls. Loss of democracies, mass death.
Okay. And your economic prosperity, and that was your link back to some event in the past you were starting.
Yeah, we started that one, but yeah, that was one of the first ideas that was posited. Yeah.
That's cool. Does anybody have any comments on that in relation to the exercise we just went through? Sorry, no. I'm going to stop presenting there for a sec. Any comments on how you found it?
I thought it was interesting to focus on a particular point in time and then drag our focus to another particular point. And then when you started mapping it back to see how you could create those linkages.
Yeah.
Challenging to start with.
Challenging, and I know the technology, my apologies.
Initially challenging to start with in terms of getting the thinking right, but I think we sort of started to get there then.
Yeah. And in fairness, when you do this in person and you have groups of people in a room and you have hexagon-shaped post-its and people are writing with markers, it is that bit easier. And I know technology brings benefits, but it brings challenges as well when you're trying to do this sort of thing. But I suppose what we're trying, if you were to think of, if you had this in your workplace and there was some complex issue that you were looking at, and you got people to come together and you said, where are we at today? And you had different groups at different tables. And if you intentionally separated them out so that senior management were at one table, your frontline at the other, maybe your IT crew or your admin people, or whatever way you want to break it down, whatever way your workplace is set out, and to get them to go through that exercise, what you will find is, what you would do in person is you would have everyone to move to the next table bar one spokesperson who would stay and tell their story. This is where we believe the company started in relation to what we were looking at, brought us to where we are today. We think possibly it could end up in this good place, but actually it could end up in this terrible place as well. And by drawing a line to something in the past, it's linking to that retrospective coherence and showing how, with all those patterns and possibilities that are out there, this could have been the case. And actually, I would have had, it, time permitting, another element of saying connect dystopia to an event in the past as well. But it's just our time has limited us. But what that can do is, we think linearly, and this event in the past caused this to happen, and this is where we're going to end up. We think it's clear. It's black and it's white. It's just like, this is the cause and effect. This upsets that thinking. And all of a sudden, you know what I mean? And some of you touched on that, like the difference of opinions, the difference of perspectives that comes out, and it helps us to get a much richer, more granular insight into what the reality actually is, not based on our lived experiences, what we usually bring to the table. It's usually through our lens and our perspective of seeing the world that we make sense of it. So now we get to see it from multiple perspectives. And I have seen leaders being really challenged by this. There was one company in the US that were after going through a merger. And at the third table, when the leaders heard that people felt dismal, mistrust, dark, them and us, then it landed. They were like, oh my God, we got it wrong. As a consultant, we can go in and say this stuff to people, to leaders, but it can be brushed off. But actually, when you hear it and you hear it and you hear it, there's a resonance at a different level that really helps for some of this stuff to stick and to really make sense. And it helps them with their decision making then. As in, we can't do that. We know it didn't work last time. We have to try something different, So out of that, that's only one of the methods you can do just to create, when you're looking at strategy. And I remember the first time I done that exercise, it was in London back in 2015. And one of the dystopian hell, we were calling it at the time, one of the things that was mentioned at many tables was Donald Trump coming into power. It was laughable at the time. It wasn't possible. This was 2015. This was not going to happen. And lo and behold, 2 years later, that did happen. So there are weak signals in there, be they of things in utopia, things that actually are plausible and they actually might happen. And if you plant seeds and you cross-pollinate and you start exploring that, saying this is how it is, but this is how it could be, and actually looking at some of the barriers that would bring that in place and focusing on those, it can help to bring that about. And also the dystopia, that's potentially can happen. And if we really don't want this to happen, this is a weak signal. This is something, it mightn't be probable, it might be possible, but it's definitely plausible that this might happen. And if we don't want that to happen, what do we want to do? We need to be thinking. So it actually loosens the blinkers and we can tap in, because some people will see things that others don't in our systems, So I'm hoping that was beneficial. It's something hands-on that you can go back and you can try it yourself straight away. And there are people have good results. Even the students that I teach actually use that themselves when they're go back to their workplaces, and there's been good feedback on that. So I suppose people's perspectives on an organization's past give them a limited view of the present, and this has a strong influence on its future. So the future backwards helps to widen these perspectives. So what you would look at here is these three things. You'd consider what were the similarities, the differences, and the surprises contained within the stories created and heard, from the different tables. And listening to other groups' accounts, it allows us to make sense of the past, develop an anticipatory awareness of the present, and begin to look at combined, collaborative, and hopefully participative visions of the future. Everyone will have a better understanding as to the actual realities, not their own perception of it. So before deciding on what strategy to adopt, this information is invaluable as it provides granular rather than fragmented data. So it can be very valuable in that regard. So it can be used for an alternative to traditional strategic scenario planning, to reveal people's real perceptions and attitudes, which often lay hidden beneath, and which aren't revealed by traditional methods, and to embed lessons from organizations past in decision making for the future. So I have a safety pulse, which I'm going to cover there. I'm going to give it 5 minutes towards the end of the presentation. I'm just going to go through these few slides here. What I will do in the meantime is...
You're not sharing any slides. Sorry, Marion.
I am. Can you not see my screen?
I can't.
Okay. Sorry. Here is me. I wasn't actually presenting, sorry. And I had all these lovely slides that I was talking through there, and you were saying, what is she talking about? But yeah, these are the slides. So you'll have these in the deck anyway. That's what I just spoke about there, these 3 parts here, the future backwards, the reasons for doing it. Okay. So can you see the screen there now, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good. So this safety pulse, and I've just put a link here in the chat that you can click on, and we'll look at that there in the next just 5 minutes towards the end, and I'll show you some of the results from that. But that's something, the future backwards is used in a workshop setting for, you know, smaller groups, representative samples, whereas SenseMaker actually can tap into some of those stories on a much bigger scale. You can collect thousands of stories, and you can start to look at patterns within that. That can be really interesting from a complexity perspective, because we're not coming in as the lens of the expert. We come in asking somebody to share a story, and via that, then we get them to actually attach meaning in relation to the story collector and the tool that we use. Whereas typically what you have is people asking leading questions, and that's what's important to the person asking the questions more so than the person answering. So it's different in that regard, and what can come out can be very interesting. And it's much harder to game the system. It's much more authentic if you can get engagement with it. So I just want to present on some useful heuristics here before we close. One is the Cobra effect. And I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this, but back in colonial times in India, there was an issue with too many cobras. And it reminds me of the frog that we were looking at earlier on. So there was a bounty brought in whereby anybody who brought in a cobra head was given a rupee or a couple of rupees. So this was brilliant. The cobras were being caught, they were being slaughtered, and the heads were being brought in. People were making money, the authorities were happy, it was working well. Until you had some innovative types who opened up cobra breeding farms and made a killing in more ways than one. So they cleaned up, they done very well, they got all these rupees, but when the authorities found out, they killed the system. They were like, we're not rewarding people here for breeding cobras. And the people who had the breeder cobra farm or the cobra breeding farms released them into the wild, and you ended up with a worse problem to finish with than what you had at the beginning. So just be mindful of that, this cobra effect, and we get it in safety with numbers. We think we have the 0, we think we have the low numbers, but actually we're gamers, you know, we will game a system. What gets measured gets manipulated. So just be very, very wary of that, just to keep be scanning the horizon for that. Don't take any KPI that you might get. They're indicators. Sometimes they're not actual fact. Some of them can get gamed, and just be mindful of that. So the other one is the Bhutto story, and I think this is very relevant. This is Bhutto was a monk who was walking down the street. It's like an old parable time, you know, and he met a guy who was on his hands and knees underneath a street lamp, and the guy was looking around. He was rooting around for something. So Bhutto said to him, he said, "Can I help you, sir? Are you looking for something?" And the guy said, "I'm looking for my keys. My wife is the devil. She'll kill me if I don't find my keys." So he said, "I'll help you." So he got down and was helping the guy. And after a while, he said, "Are you sure you left your keys here? They don't appear to be here at all." And the man said, "Well, I know for sure they're not here, but it didn't make sense to look in the dark. This was the only place there was light." And even though that's a kind of a parable story, I just think it really, it's a nice analogy for like our organizations. We still use a lot of the same methods, even though we know we're not going to find what we're looking for by shining a light on this place with this particular light that we have, but we do it anyway because it's what's there. Instead of actually trying to be somewhat braver, going upstream, you know, going against the current, because even dead fish go with the flow. It ties in with that, you know, that we're actually going out there into the dark. And what can light up the dark for us are our employees, if we listen and take on board their perspective. So we can do that via, you know, working with stories, involving them, getting perspectives, involving them in decision making, or taking on board those accounts before decision making. And that can actually make it less scary to go into that uncertain place, you know. And I think that's just a good analogy. So sometimes our eyes are open, but we cannot see. So just to bear that in mind as well. Our organizations are full of blind spots whereby we can't possibly know what is really happening in every nook and cranny. So we have to bear that in mind. and involve our people and the various stakeholders in the system as well. And the thing is not to mix up correlation and causation. We've seen so many examples of this in the past year, you know. So if you look here, the number of people who have drowned by falling into a pool correlates with the films Nicolas Cage appeared in. You know, this is just an example. But we can always find something to match our narrative. Whatever point we're trying to prove, the information is out there to get it. But it's about looking consistently across the board to make sure that we're looking at the whole picture and not just trying to prove. And we've seen that with COVID from various angles. You know, you'll see people pulling out stuff to suit the narrative, but it's not looking at the science in general. It might be looking at a certain one study or whatever, you know. So just bear that in mind. So inattentional blindness is the other thing. And here is an X-ray that was given to cardiologists, okay? And you can see it here, the blue dots on the right-hand side are where their eye movements were, all right? Does anybody see anything in these that looks out of place? Not that any of you are experts now in X-rays or anything. But if you can see here on the left-hand side, right, there's actually a gorilla. Can you see it there?
It's the Dan Simons effect.
Yeah, but it's like actually this gorilla was placed in there intentionally and only 17% of the radiologists saw it, you know? So you only see what you expect to see. So sometimes what's right in front of us, we don't actually see because we don't expect to see it. So it's just about bearing that in mind. When we talk here about dystopia and utopia, we're trying to tap into the 17%. You know what I mean? What do they actually see as to what can be that reality? You know, so just be mindful of the inattentional blindness. We're all, to a certain extent, you know, we don't see what we don't expect to see, but there are things out there that can be seen if we're actually open to them, you know, and loosening those blinkers. So that's the chest image there and the eye position, and the link is there as well. I'll have that in the information that's sent on to you. So 17% of people see something novel. So it's just to be aware of that in our organizations as well. So the fourth heuristic that I'm going to present here is premature convergence. And this is whereby we don't want people actually in meetings just agreeing for the sake of agreeing. Because the boss says something, no one dares disagree with it, and we're all going to agree. That's not a good place to be. So if everybody is just nodding, like nodding donkeys in agreement, that's not a good place to be. We're looking for healthy criticism here, constructive criticism, to encourage dialogue, trashing things out, you know, talking about what might happen, looking at those 17%, you know what I mean? What are the weak signals that might be there? So just be mindful of that. Just because everyone is in agreement is not necessarily a good thing. It's not that you want people fighting or arguing, but it's good to actually pick things asunder, do you know what I mean? And actually really delve into them before we actually commit and move forward. So number 5 then is just the Hawthorne effect. So when we talk about developing some safe to fail probes, we're talking about small little actions locally, and collectively they can build up to have a big impact. And this is what happens in can happen in complexity. I mentioned earlier on in change programs, 75% of them fail, and this is released in the McKenzie's and the PwC's and what have you out there. 75% fail because we're looking at some idealistic future state. We introduce some change program, all eyes are on it. Management want to make sure this is working. What are the KPIs looking like? What's this? Is everything working? People will, because of that light being shone on them. If you remember back to Hawthorne and Elton Mayo's study done back in the 1930s, you know, they actually studied people and they were putting the lighting up and they were moving it down. They found when they increased the lighting that people were more productive. Then when they actually increased it again, they got more productive again. Then they lessened the lighting and people still got more productive. And they were like, okay, what's going on? But it's actually when people are being observed, their behavior changes. So if we're going to shine a big light for some change program, people will tell you it's working, even though it'll be a case of the emperor's new clothes a lot of the time, in 75% of the cases. So what we're looking at here is multiple safe to fail experiments happening at the same time. There's no big light shining on them. They're all happening in parallel. Some will work, some won't, but it's much more organic and there's much better chance of changing the system via that approach than with your big overall go in with a big change program with all eyes on it because of the Hawthorne effect. So here we just talk about a little bit about the Hawthorne effect, working with stories to create small experiments for change. And this is an excerpt from the Cynefin book. So I'm going to let you read that yourselves, guys. I'm just conscious of time here. So the whole purpose of this is the butterfly effect, whereby the small changes will bring about, big improvements within the organizations. So as Albert Einstein says, wherever emerging entities that emerge from our interactions with each other, okay? So uncertainty can be uncomfortable. It comes with the territory of complexity, and we have to get comfortable with uncertainty when working with complex challenges. It just comes with the territory. And just like the stepping stones here, you have to stand on a stone and take a leap before you can possibly see where you're going to take your next step. And that can be a bit uncomfortable for some, but when you're dealing with something like this to progress, that's what you actually need to do. There is no guarantees a lot of the time when you're working in that complex space. So another quote here saying that while the ability of narrative to shape society has always been there, the Tudors had the best propagandist of all time in Shakespeare. The rapid and near instantaneous connection of micro-narratives, rumours and the like in the modern world at times seems to be the equivalent of 1 million butterflies flapping their wings in unison, or possibly 1 trillion butterfly bots, okay? And I just think that's like, when you look at the power of stories, and I saw that come up in some of your future backwards, some of the divide that's there, and some of that, like when you look at the fake news and we look at assemblages, all that feeds in like as well, So it just be mindful that that butterfly effect, like, small actions can have big changes in a positive and a negative way as well, So just to wrap up there, characteristics of complex systems: patterns repeat by accident. The system is dispositional, it's not causal. The system lightly constrains the agents. Okay, so you've enabling constraints. The agents modify the system with their interactions, constantly playing and pushing boundaries. Coherency appears in retrospect, but not in advance. Actions will always have unintended consequences. Okay, so just be mindful of that from the outset. Engineering the future state is not possible, and hindsight does not lead to foresight. Okay. So does anybody have any questions? I see we've 3 minutes left. Am I pushing boundaries, Kelvin, to show that the sense maker, the safety pulse?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, but that we can. I think we've got to where is a good place to land.
Yeah. So if anybody does want to hang on for a few minutes afterwards, I'm happy to show them that if they want to. I've sent the link in the chat anyway that you can fill it in. But if anybody wants to look at results and how that works, I'm happy to go through that with them as well. So my apologies for trying to squeeze too much into a session, which I hope was helpful.
Thanks, Marion. That was great.
Is that okay, Ian? Yeah.
Thank you.
You okay, guys? I'm happy to stay on here if anybody has any questions or anything. I'll start presenting here now. And if any of you have any comments, or if you're like, that wasn't.
It was really cool. I enjoyed
it
a lot. At the start, you said you're hoping it wasn't too dense with theory, but it's interesting theory, not just dead weight. So yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and we can always go back and watch it later. That's what's great about this format, is if it's too dense, it adds richness, and you can watch it again and again and again and still get something from it. Yeah.
So even in relation to that with SenseMaker, maybe I can create a short video, Kelvin, that can be added there for the guys to look at later. Maybe that might be a way of a screen.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
So if you guys want to share stories and that, you can, because it's interactive. And if you did share stories, it would pop up straight away. And it's very interesting to see how you can look at these patterns shifting in front of your eyes by clicking into people's stories. So any other comments?
Sorry, I was going to say, with the safety pulse, so is this something that you would take back to an organisation and release to the workers to get that the underground stories to the surface and understand the different forces at play? Is that,
Yeah, because typically, I suppose, we wait for people to come to our safety management systems and engage by what they perceive to be something safety related. And a lot of the time, the work that we do, it can be stuff that may not be necessarily trigger that safety thinking hat. It could be just normal work, but actually it's something that frustrates them in relation to people, like, their audio or their video being misaligned with their audio, or flying in the face of their own policies and instructions. There could be bullying, there could be just this pressure not to. So all that stuff can come out via a prompt of a story, which somebody mightn't necessarily come to your safety management system with. So if you're prompting, tell us something that worked well actually recently. Tell us of something that you think, some policy or regulation that either helped or hindered. You know, you're prompting people to think, and you're getting the good as well as the bad then. So, and I think for safety leader, not just safety, but for business leaders, it's really encouraging to see the whole donut, not just the whole. In safety in particular, we tend to be coming in with all this bad stuff and all this negative stuff. All of a sudden we're seeing actually this is what we're doing well, and it's great to see some stories coming back in relation to this. So it gives a bit of a clap on the back and a bit of kudos for actually investing in this and supporting it as well, which can be very encouraging for senior leaders as well, you know, to see that.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for explaining.
No worries.
Yeah, thanks, Marion. Really interesting, really thought-provoking. So much appreciated.
No worries. And as I say, Kelvin and Sue are developing and working with Chris at the minute on some self-paced learning to go into some deeper material as well. If people want to explore it a bit further, that'll be coming out in the coming months, I suppose, weeks and months. Yeah.
That'd be brilliant. Awesome.
Thanks, Bryn.
Yeah, nice one.
Marion, may I ask, the dystopia utopia exercise that we did, have you experience in using that in the investigation context with groups, learning teams, you know, after a particular untoward incident or that sort of thing? Do you think it's a useful tool in that context, or is that misplaced there? I was just thinking about how I might use it from time to time.
Some of that stuff has come out organically. I have used it more for where is safety today. You know, where are we? I use it for psychosocial aspects of work, as well as looking at safety or at work and what's helping and hindering us. And what does come out is some of that stuff. But I'm sure if you did look at where we've had several work at height incidents, we want to look at working at heights. Where are we today in relation to that? What in the past has brought us here? You know, you can do what you are going through more of a, I suppose, a restricted lens, I suppose, when you're bringing it that way. But actually, if you're looking at it, it can be really helpful to look at what is working, what isn't that you mightn't be aware of in relation to some of those. In general, some of those actually come out anyway in the sessions. And,
yeah, it just sort of applies some structure to how you have the, you know, approach that question maybe with a group, or even or even subgroups within, say, a team that was involved in a particular incident, for example. So that was just what I was wondering, if it was a useful tool in that situation.
What it's really helpful for is a bigger group. You know what I mean? If you have 3 or 4 tables of 5 or 6, then you're really getting people exposed to the different perspectives. So with one group of 5 or 6, you will get, so depending on the group, depending on the context, the organization, how willing they are to share, how much trust they have in the system. Whereas actually, if it's a more general thing, saying we're actually looking in general, not just at this incident, in general, we want to explore it. Is there anything else we could be doing that might be more fruitful, I'd say, in trying to come up with some material. COVID is very useful from the perspective of us today, because it's something that we all have experience in common. Sometimes when you're doing these exercises, we would have looked pre-COVID at looking at transport in a city or something, because you've people from all over. Whereas COVID has actually been good now for this exercise for us. But in all your workplaces, you have some subject matters which are, you know, people will be more than willing to talk, and they have lots to say about them in relation to where it can be used for projects, project management. Where are we today in relation to this project? What in the past brought us here? And you get to see what helped and hindered. And then in future, what might we change for the next project management based on this? What did work well? And what could we bring in there actually as part of the steps of that? And which part are we going to lose that were non-value added? You know, because people will have lots of stuff to talk about, but they're usually not given the space for that. I know in Amsterdam a few years back, we done this with a group of safety professionals, and they were like, this is just an opportunity we're rarely afforded, and it's so beneficial to take our heads up every now and again, look at the path we're on, because sometimes we're so busy going somewhere, our heads are down, we're not even seeing what's happening left and right, you know.
Yeah, the one thing it's screaming at me for at the moment is, you know, how to manage surgical waiting list pressures, and that's that may be part of a bigger discussion. Yeah, thank you very much. Really useful session. Thank you.
Okay, Rachel, glad you enjoyed it. No worries. I'll see you, Bryn. All the best.
Thanks, everyone.
See you guys. Thanks again.
Bye.
Awesome session.
Thanks, guys. All the best.